Over the centuries, there have been many fashions and trends that have steered us to garden the way that we do. We've been inspired to grow new and exotic plants, we've landscaped our gardens, we've added pergolas and paving, and we've even sown wildflower meadows. But behind the scenes, there has been an horticultural elite who, unbeknown to us, have influenced the way that we garden.
Of course, it's impossible to say who is the best or the greatest gardener, but from anything else, there have been so many of them. But over the next hour, we shall be taking an intimate look at a small handful of our living gardening heroes.
We meet the man who has travelled the world in search of new plants, and whose infectious enthusiasm never fails to inspire those who meet him. We meet the vegetable queen, whose meticulous research changed our salad bowls forever, and showed us that we could all grow veg, even on the smallest of plots. We meet the man who masterminded some of the grandest restoration projects for the National Trust. And the gardener who was ahead of her time as an advocate of natural planting. We meet an extraordinary couple who gave up everything to spread the word of organic gardening. And the garden designer who transformed our traditional back gardens into stylish outdoor rooms. But first, we come to a man who's had a long and distinguished career in horticulture and yet still possesses the capacity to surprise and delight. I'm talking, of course, about Christopher Lloyd. Christopher Lloyd is one of our most successful and influential garden writers. His own garden, Great Dixter in Sussex, has become one of the most famous gardens in Britain. He has inspired us to be courageous and experimental, and to break with convention when it comes to planting and the use of colour. At the age of 84, he is still pushing the boundaries. He's someone whose outspoken opinions are often contentious, but he is undoubtedly a brilliant plantsman and one of our great garden writers.
I think Great Dixter is one of the best gardens in Britain, if not the world. I love his writing too. You can just hear his voice, and he doesn't care what people think about him. You know, if he says put this with that, and it's all crazy colours, and he once said to me, you know, people think I do this to shock them. I don't. I just do it because I love it.
Over the years, I have become more and more aware of how much I owe him in terms of setting the highest standards for anybody who enters this field and taking the subject seriously, and in never losing the excitement which you actually have about this whole process of gardening.
He makes you think, he makes you look again at what you've taken for granted you'll do, and to see it with fresh eyes, and I think that's so important.
I mean, who else would change the effect in a bed 3 times a year? They do at Dixter.
My passion for writing dates back a long way, as I love the English language and its richness. Some people think that my language is too rich and they don't know what the words are that I'm using. But if you're born into and educated into a rich language, why not use it to the full? Gardening itself must be an all-consuming passion, and you must be able to communicate that with other people, I think, because I think people are more important than plants, and I never get that.
If ever there was someone who was born to garden, it was Christopher Lloyd. He has lived at his family home, Great Dixter, his entire life, and since early childhood has been a passionate gardener.
I was the last of 6 children, and I was the only one that really took any interest in the garden, but I did, right from the start, so it must have been in my blood. And my father saw that I was interested in plants. In a piece of the garden, which we call the Blue Garden, I remember him saying, well, this piece of the garden is for you to look after the way you want it. I was quite flattered. Dixter is a very individual place, and it doesn't follow patterns, and it develops in its own way, which you might call wayward, but definitely very individual. The gardening, of course, was my joy, gave me my stimulus for creativity. But now that I'm very old and can hardly get down on my knees and certainly can't get up again without help, I'm very glad that I've got people to do the hard work for me. But I can still see what wants doing, and I can tell them what I would like. Every day is a day of inspection. I've seen 3 things to tell Fergus about already. Poor Fergus.
So what's going to happen here is we've done the wallflowers, we'll do this sort of short-term bedding, and then that'll come out, and then I'll sow the zinnias in 2 weeks' time.
Fergus Garrett is Christopher's head gardener. He's worked at Great Dixter for the last 12 years, and since the day he started, the meeting of minds between guru and gardener has made for a dynamic and creative partnership.
I can't tell you what a good relationship it has been right from the start. And he is brilliant. He is very creative, and he's so much better than I am at so many things. But he's always tremendously loyal to me.
We wouldn't want to be detached from him. So all the decisions go through him, and we discuss it. We discuss it quite openly, and it's a free thinking place for all of us.
Everyone who works here wants to be here. You know, they choose to work in, and they're sort of 100% committed and enthusiastic, and it builds a tremendous spirit.
As you can see, he's out in the garden walking around, and he doesn't miss a thing.
It's the only place that I haven't had a day off sick, you know, since I've been here, so I think it speaks a lot. Hello, Christo.
You haven't had a day off?
A day off sick, I said, Christo.
I'm not sure I believe that.
I haven't had one in 4 years.
Well, there's plenty of action here.
Yeah.
Christopher's knowledge of plants is intimate and based on a lifetime's experience at Great Dixter. And when it comes to planning his borders, he still has a clear picture of what he wants to achieve.
That's Nicotiana that we've got in the porch display.
Yes, that's a fascinating
interesting
plant,
thing, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It starts white and then deepens.
Or does it start?
No.
He has an insatiable passion to experiment, and his radical use of clashing colours and textures has long stimulated and provoked fellow gardeners.
Well, I don't think I would want to put sort of scarlet and orange and purple together here in my garden. I can enjoy it perfectly well in his, where he uses it with such skill, but also where the setting is right for it.
It's a high-maintenance garden, and I think somebody said low maintenance means low braintenance, and we believe that. We want with high input, high output for us.
I've got an internal vision, which is very lucky, that I can imagine plants. I don't have to put them in front of me and see them in the flesh before I can appreciate how they will look when they're mature. I can visualize that and move them around in my head, which cuts a lot of corners.
Visitors to Great Dixter are inevitably inspired by what is perhaps the greatest example of plant combinations and colours in any garden today. Certainly his garden continues to inspire Christopher's work, which remains provoking, amusing and always original.
I'd read his book, The Well-Tempered Garden, and I thought it was the most witty, irritating in some ways, controversial, all sorts of things. It really got me going, this book.
He's not afraid to say that a buddleia looks like a stream of vomit, and that, you know, he hates begonias, and it's funny, it's entertaining.
I must reread The Well-Tempered Garden sometime. People keep on telling me how good it is. I wrote it such a long time ago that I can't remember what I put in it. But I think I did cover a tremendous lot of ground, probably a lot of it was rubbish, so that is one good reason for never reading it myself again.
There is certainly never a dull moment in Christopher Lloyd's garden or his writing. He's famous for his outspoken, even cantankerous views, but this hasn't stopped him forming some firm friendships, especially with Beth Chatto, our next gardening hero. Beth Chatto revolutionised how we think about planting by insisting that the conditions of the garden should dictate the type of plants that we use, a theory that she's put to good use in her own stunning garden.
You believe completely in everything that she writes about the plants because she understands them intuitively, but she's also got that really interesting combination which is very particular to her, I think, of having that deep practicality with an artist's eye, and it's a winning combination.
You can go in and you can see what she plants in dry shade, what she plants in these wet ditches, all the different conditions. Actually, you can see the written page living out in the garden.
She had a fantastic sort of catchphrase, which is make sure that the right plant is in the right place, something we could all remember. So she really taught people how to garden in a way that is always going to be the right way of gardening.
Beth Chatto has spent over 40 years cultivating this site in Essex, which, along with heavy clay, includes almost pure gravel, and she was one of the first to champion the growing of drought-resistant plants.
I made a gravel garden not because it was a fashionable thought or idea, but because I had no alternative. That's what it is, gravel soil. It's about 20 to 25 feet deep. We top it with clean gravel, but if you dig a hole, you could use it for building.
The site was an old car park, which, when it was dug up, gave Beth the opportunity to try out an experiment on an unprecedented scale.
We incorporated as much compost, muck, anything in that top bit to start with. If we replant something, of course, we dig a big hole and put some better soil in, give it a good chance, but then it has to stand on its own. There's no irrigation. Has been no irrigation in 12 years. 2 years back, when we had temperatures of 100 here in the garden, there was not a flower in sight. But there were grasses, there were interesting leaves, there were the sweeps of gravel. It was a pattern of foliage and shapes and textures, and people were interested in it.
The reason that people were interested was because she had managed to create a large, beautiful garden on such an unpromising site. She had dry, arid soil at the top and wet, boggy conditions at the bottom. And this gave her the opportunity to plant up specific areas with the plants that could best adapt and thrive.
The garden has evolved where there are at least 3 different styles of garden, although they harmonise and lead one into the other. There's the hot, dry garden, the gravel garden. Then there's the water gardens, which we've made by damming the spring-fed ditch. And finally, there's the gardens for dry shade.
Beth built up a vast collection of plants for these habitats with the help of her husband Andrew, who throughout his life studied plant ecology. Helped by his knowledge, Beth was able to pursue and develop this method of natural gardening.
The wood garden began after the 87 storm. Up until then, Andrew and I had agreed we would let it develop ecologically. When he came here as a young man of 21, it was really quite scrubby. When it was blown down, it had got to the point where all the understory had really died out. And because it really had destroyed its normal succession, Andrew said, you can go ahead and make a garden there now. Sometimes he would say, Beth is the engine and I'm the brake. And that was very necessary because I was passionate.
In fact, Beth was so passionate that she decided to start showing at Chelsea Flower Show in the 1960s.
I remember taking my mum to Chelsea one year, seeing her stand, and we spent our entire time at that stand because it was just full of wonderment. And the very next year I was doing it myself, so she's been a real inspiration to me in every way.
Everybody had amazing stands of vegetables all looking perfect and roses looking perfect, and people weren't using plants in a naturalistic way, and what she was very clever at doing, I think, was choosing plants that often they were very close to the wild plant. So she'd use a particular form of buttercup, for instance, that she'd selected, and she'd then combine that with ornamental grasses, you know, and nobody was doing that.
I think if I'd taken nettles to Chelsea, the press would have been relieved to have something different to talk about. But it was just the fact that the style of arranging was different, the fact that the pots were made to look as though they were growing, plants were supported if they weren't tall enough, and then you had to hide all the structure underneath. It looked like a living garden, and we even had a little pond.
Chelsea was a showcase for the nursery that she runs in Essex, where hundreds of plants are laid out according to their different growing habitats. There's a huge range that, with Beth's artistic eye, can be put together into stunning plant combinations.
Oh, I adore this fern. Dropteris erythrosaura, there you can see. All its new leaves come this lovely rusty shade. Isn't that charming? And these are last autumn's leaves. They make a sort of setting for the bronze coming up. I think it's a lovely fern, heart's tongue. This grows all over the place in the West Country, doesn't it? In wet, damp places. It doesn't so much so easily here. But you see, already that makes a picture. All of these are the woodland plants, the Solomon's seal. There's one with double flowers there. They're not just out quite yet. I need to make space for these heucheras, which again you see are introducing such good colour. Plum pudding. Rather a good name, I think, don't you, for that? My feeling is it still is my private garden, which I'm very happy to share with like-minded gardeners. And really, there's two sides. I enjoy having people in the garden. I enjoy sharing the garden. I don't necessarily always stop and speak to people, but sometimes I am stopped and asked if I'm one of the gardeners, or do I work here, or do I know anything? Can I answer a question? But the other side is, of course, when there's no one here, and then it has a completely different feel. It was made with a lot of endeavour and patience and enthusiasm.
Energy and enthusiasm are essential when you're making any garden, but when it comes to the restoration of any of our large stately homes, then you also need a keen sense of history. After the Second World War, life in the great houses was never the same again, and many historic gardens had gone into decline or had been dug up to make way for food production. But in the 1950s, the slow path to restoration began, much to the delight of the visiting gardening masses. No organisation did more to breathe life back into these great gardens than the National Trust. And one man who worked for the Trust for 25 years lovingly restored 168 of them. The beauty and historical significance of some of Britain's most prestigious gardens are down to the talent and artistic vision of John Sayles. In 1974, he was appointed head of gardens of the National Trust and remained in that role for 25 years. He masterminded some of the grandest restorations, and in doing so, strongly influenced our perception of the British garden.
He was an absolute pioneer in establishing that proper research needed to be done on gardens before you could just launch in and, sort of decide how you wanted it to look, just because it might look pretty.
John was a plantsman, a designer, a communicator. He was a garden historian, a planner, put it all together, and that's what garden conservation is nowadays. And John put that mix together and established the credibility of the Trust in the field of garden conservation.
He was very, very important in actually trying to sort of say to the Trust, look, this isn't just about planting up beds. These gardens have a history and layers of meaning that are just as important as what's going on in the houses.
It really wasn't until the 1940s that the Trust really started to get interested in long-term conservation of gardens. It didn't really know anything about them, really, or how to deal with them. Nobody did. There was no expertise and no basis of expertise in this matter.
John worked closely with Graham Stewart Thomas, the first head of gardens for the National Trust. Graham's role was to create historic and artistic settings to show off the great houses, but his style of gardening had its roots in the arts and crafts movement. When he retired in 1974, John took over, and with his eye for detail and talent for restoration, he was instrumental in realising the historical significance of these gardens, and as well as attending to their everyday appearance, started planning for their long-term future.
Gardens are dynamic, they're always changing, therefore you've got to plan for change. You've got not just simply to restore something, you have to choreograph its future, as it were. You go to a place like Starhead or Powys Castle and you've got one layer on the top of another layer on top of another layer, and there they all are, all jostling around, and the older bits, which are sometimes the most important, are dying, and the younger bits that may be less important are becoming more prominent. So one of the things that you've got to do is to get that balance right.
A place where John has certainly got it right is Powys Castle. It's now a world-famous garden with a unique character.
I think the thing that gives that quality to Powys are things like the clipped yews on the terraces, which have been there for 300 years. And when they planted them, nobody said, if we plant them now in 300 years' time, they'll turn into these marvellous, bumpy, old funny shapes. And that is gardeners working on them for 300 years. And it's worth going to Powys just to gaze at those wonderful pieces of sculptural topiary.
National Trust gardens span more than 400 years of history, and despite each of them having different historical layers resting on top of one another, John recognised that no garden, however old, is ever static. It'll always keep growing. So he encouraged the Trust gardeners to start thinking about the future whilst preserving the true spirit in which the gardens were first created. One such garden was Biddulph Grange in Stoke-on-Trent. This extraordinary garden, created by the Victorian industrialist James Bateman, was destroyed beyond all recognition when the house was converted into a hospital in 1923. John, with an army of gardeners and historians, had to pick up the pieces and put it back together again. They documented and saved rare collections of plants, some of which were the first specimens to have come to Britain. They also had to recreate all of the idiosyncrasies of Bateman's highly eccentric garden, where one moment you're in a Scottish glen, and then you turn the corner to find yourself in a Chinese water garden.
Walking in through from the glen, it's a marvellous revelation, and it was totally overgrown. And the Chinese terrace here was totally derelict, as you imagine, been vandalised. But the thing that came to light most about the garden was the pseudo-larix there, the golden larch, is documented as being one of the first batch that came into the country. And that is the only survivor of that first batch introduced to the country, seedlings dug up by Robert Fortune. Now, the significance of that plant is higher than probably any other plant that the National Trust has. Bateman was only here for 30 years. He packed masses of stuff into the garden, masses and masses of trees as they came in, lots of plants. And he put everything in without really thinking about the long-term future. So we have to think about the long-term future. So our approach to that is not to be too precious about individual trees, to keep the garden young. I haven't much intelligence or anything like that. What I do have is persistence, and everybody says you're dogged, you're determined, and once deciding on a plan, I just like to find ways of making it happen. even if it takes 10 or 15 years, he's coming back and saying, oh, well, you know, it's worked at last.
Guided by John's vision, millions of us have been inspired by our trips to National Trust Gardens. But our next gardening hero is a famous garden designer who's worked very much on the domestic scale. And he has transformed the way that we view and use our own gardens at home. After the war, our tastes in gardens were still largely functional. There were spaces where we grew vegetables and perhaps had a bit of lawn. But in the early 1960s, the first garden centres opened, and suddenly we had access to exotic plants that we could buy over the counter. For a long time, rockeries and island beds were popping up all over the place, and we even splashed out on a bit of colour. For many people, this idea of gardening purely for pleasure was a novel experience, and the question of design didn't really enter into the equation until one man came along and taught us to look at the garden as an extension of our home. In fact, to treat the garden as an outdoor room. John Brooks changed the way we use our outdoor spaces forever. He revolutionised the small suburban garden in his book Room Outside, where he outlined his principles of garden design in an easily understandable way.
He made it accessible and possible for everyday people to see the potential of their own domestic garden spaces.
He said, come on, stop looking out on that bit of lawn with 3 rose beds and the sundial in the middle. He said, get out there and make your garden another room of the house.
It made people more aware that they could use this outdoor space and they didn't have to just go and visit stately homes and that sort of thing. It was there on their doorstep. It's just a question of how to use that space effectively.
The garden is essentially a place for people to use. As people started going abroad, they were interested in sunbathing and a place for kids to play. And as there was this need for newer, smaller housing, with often smaller gardens in these developments, there was a need to try and find a way to design those gardens. You were starting to get buildings with huge glazed doors that would push back, patio doors we call them now, but you know, they were a very modernist sort of thing. And how do you make this transition from inside to out? It seemed to make sense to think about the proportion of the house, as indeed the architect had, and why not carry those proportions out into the garden? This name, Room Outside, seemed to make a nice title, because one was just carrying the functions of the house from inside into out. And that's how it came about.
An outdoor room is a phrase we're all familiar with today. But in the 1950s, the concept of using the garden as a space for living and entertainment was a new and novel idea. This modern way of living came about at the time of the Festival of Britain in 1951. In a bid to lift morale after the war years, the festival was a showcase for new ideas in art, science and designs for the home and garden. And it did much to influence a shift from the functional and traditional to a more modern style of garden.
Garden-wise, we still had our head very much buried in the sort of Surrey garden world and Miss Jekyll and all that sort of stuff. And that frustrated me enormously because, of course, having seen the art world, I was very keen on modernism.
But some of these modern designs were a little austere, and John wanted to translate them to make them work for ordinary people. He drew inspiration from a wave of influential modernist artists, such as the abstract work of Ben Nicholson, as well as the landscape architect Thomas Church, who had perfected the art of blending highly modern gardens with the landscape beyond. Now, Church's designs tended to be very grand, but John loved them, and he began to explore these ideas within natural landscapes and, critically, small urban gardens.
You can see, if you look this way, the geometry coming through and the way in which that path progresses across the garden. The planting tends to sort of soften it, but the grass popping out from time to time brings it back again onto the tram lines.
They are non-gimmicky gardens. They are just really good, classic gardens. They didn't rely on going crazy or painting something a mad colour or installing something weird to make it a particular space. They were just very, very sensible, accessible designs.
He's always got something new he's thinking of doing. At the moment he's really into sort of the wilder planting, and whilst other people are doing it, he's always really interesting to listen to because he often has a slightly different take on it.
To a degree I use this garden to experiment in for myself. We have this very gravelly soil, and I use gravel as a basic ground medium and let things self-seed and sucker and pull out what I don't want rather than put in what I do the whole time. And it gives a very sort of relaxed feeling, but the more relaxed your planting is, the stronger the design needs to be underneath. And there's a very fine line between a mess and a natural look. It's over that line, one way and the other, I sort of play the whole time.
John Brooks's designs have shaped vast numbers of our contemporary back gardens. But his modernising influence didn't mean that the traditional skills were abandoned altogether.
Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm passionate about growing vegetables. And one of the great things about growing veg nowadays is that there is a wide range to choose from. But until quite recently, that wasn't always the case.
After the Second World War and the demise of the walled garden, we saw the loss of many varieties of fruit and vegetables. Staple produce of potatoes and soggy overcooked greens became commonplace. The choice was very limited and often bland, as food was grown increasingly for maximum yields rather than flavour.
But one woman travelled far and wide in pursuit of variety and taste in vegetables. And with her rigorous and analytical approach, she took vegetable growing away from the specialist and away from men in allotments, because it was in those days nearly always men, and made a wide range of vegetables available to the ordinary gardener at home.
Joy Larkham demonstrated that everyone has room for vegetables, even in the tiniest of gardens. She also pioneered the cut-and-come-again salads, and she changed the very way that we grow vegetables by introducing varieties that we can harvest all the year round.
Talk about Queen of the Salads. The books she wrote were completely wonderful because it's all based on first-hand knowledge. You knew that something that you read of Joy's, it was absolutely authentic, it was born out of real knowledge, and she'd done it all.
Joy is a really passionate individual. She really believes 150% in what she's doing, and that's one of the reasons why she's had such an influence on vegetable growing in this country.
I think she's turned growing vegetables into an art form. She's so terribly creative with it. I mean, not only does she make you want to grow them just to eat them all, but she makes you want to grow them to have fun with them, you know, to play with them and make beautiful gardens.
Joy Larkham's first steps in gardening began as a child, when she helped her father dig up the lawn to grow vegetables. Her family lived in China for some of her youth, and when she left school they encouraged her to study horticulture.
The interest in vegetables, I think, it was probably dormant for years, because after I qualified in horticulture, I was always one of the students that was so bad that they actually desperately hoped I'd get married early so I wouldn't be a drain on the horticultural profession. It really wasn't until I met Don in my 30s and we married and moved to the Fens, then bought a house and had kids. Then the whole passion about, you know, growing things and feeding your own kids and having my own plot of land, that's, you know, when it started, I think, in earnest.
At that time, when the conventional view of growing your own was very limited, she started to experiment with and write about growing different and unusual varieties of vegetables.
Faber and Faber asked me to do a book on growing vegetables in small gardens, which is a joke, because I had 2 acres of garden, you know. But it was partly in researching that book that I started to become aware of the different things happening on the continent.
So, in 1976, they packed up and headed off in a caravan to Europe.
Our children were 5 and 7. Don's a teacher, so in theory he was going to teach the kids on our travels. And it did seem a little mad.
On their grand vegetable tour, they collected all sorts of unusual vegetable seeds, and eventually they arrived in Italy.
I think the first day we went into a little local town, and it was the first time we'd ever seen a little market stall where she had masses of different baskets of salad plants, you know, like corn salad and wild rocket and probably dandelions, all this kind of thing. And she was just literally, people were taking handfuls and putting them into a bag, you know, for a mixed salad, which really I think was the forerunner now of what's in the supermarkets, you know, just seeing this woman. And the Italians called it insalatine, which means tiny little salad leaves. I misheard that as saladini, but somehow the word has stuck. But also we saw things like the lolo lettuce, you know, the red frilly lettuce. It had only recently been bred. I said, what's it called? And he said, Lolo, you know, he was doing this, you know, after Lollobrigida, because of its, you know, lovely wavy leaves and so on, you know. So that was probably the forerunner of all the many now bright red lettuces that you get everywhere. When we came back from the trip, well, we were virtually penniless. We just had to get down to, you know, earning money. What we did start doing was growing and selling mixed bags of salad. It was amazing how many people like Marks and Spencer's and Sainsbury's and some of the big packers and people actually would turn up on our little plot in Suffolk. I think they're always expecting something much bigger, you know. But you know, we were growing so many plants that they hadn't seen.
Gradually, Joy's ideas filtered through to the general public, and her fascination with salad vegetables didn't end there. Her research into hardy winter greens led her to China.
The thing I think we got from our trips to the Orient was the concept of how the Chinese grow things, the intensity, the intercropping, which has always absolutely fascinated me anyway. The way they use every part of a plant. You know, something like a radish, we just use the radish root. They use the young leaves, they use the pods, they use the root, of course, itself. And something like garlic, they eat every bit of it. They eat the flowering stem, they eat the leaves, they eat the garlic.
Joy brought back all the gardening knowledge that she had discovered on her travels, as well as a collection of oriental seeds.
And the number of people said to me, I haven't got the space to grow vegetables because my garden's too small. I mean, it's red rag to a bull for anyone to say that to me. But I just felt using these intensive techniques and the lovely colours and textures of vegetables, you could have a tiny garden that was productive and beautiful.
Through her books, Joy established a reputation as an expert and made growing vegetables accessible to all gardeners. But when commissioned to write the history of vegetables for an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, she needed help, and turned to the formidable doyen of gardening and the historian Rosemary Veery for guidance.
Rosemary being very forthright when it came to the point, she said, well, now, what does that girl know about the history of vegetables? You know, and the answer was mighty little. So she invited me down to her place. She was so appalled at my lack of history knowledge that she did a huge chart of all the English kings and queens, you know, literally, and gave it to me and said, now go, make it work in with that, you know. But she gave me the complete run of her library. And I found all the plants we've been finding on the continent were in these old gardening books. So we weren't really doing anything new at all, you know, just felt that Queen Victoria and Brussels sprouts came in and everything else kind of went out, you know.
3 years ago, Joy and Don moved on to their next challenge, retirement. But not of the cosy slippers by the fire variety. They've taken on a generous Irish half-acre of land surrounding a farmhouse by the sea, which is completely exposed to the elements.
We did choose a windy site. We fell in love with the house, and I don't think we quite appreciated when we bought the house what a windy site it was. You can see how few trees there are around here. But it has been a lot of physical hard work to get the garden going. The first thing that could have happened to me was meeting Don. And the first present he ever brought me was a bag of pig manure from friends he was visiting. And I thought that was such a good sign of the men in my life at the time. He was the only one who had taken my request for pig manure seriously. And, he's just been great.
Being a committed organic gardener, Joy uses the natural resources available in the area for her garden, and in this case, it's seaweed.
It's got so many minerals in it. I mean, it's been used as a fertiliser for centuries, but I suppose it's partly the bulk, like any organic matter. But I think also it just gets so many of the minerals from the sea are dissolved in it. I don't think they really know what the composition is, but it does have an amazing effect on crops, on the quality of crops. And also we just use it to mulch, to stop the soil drying out and keep the weeds down. And when it gets crispy, I think it stops the slugs to some extent, because, you know, they hate a rough surface. So it does a multitude of good purposes, really. He totally took over the sort of housework side, the kids, the cooking, while I did the kind of photography and the journalism and so on. And then when I went on my trips to China and so on, you know, he looked after the family and everything. No, I've been very lucky.
Joy Larkham's enthusiasm and knowledge has inspired generations of vegetable growers and has expanded the entire range of vegetables that we now take for granted.
An aspect of gardening that's influenced me more than any other is the organic movement. Now, the debate about the use of chemicals in food production and farming and its effect on the environment and on our health is very much a hot topic at the moment. But it's not a new one. This has been running for a long time. And it concerned Lawrence Hills, who was a horticulturalist with a keen interest in organic growing.
He set up the Henry Doubleday Research Association in 1954 to investigate the properties of the herb comfrey and to research ways of gardening organically. 20 years later, he needed some help, so he wrote an ad in the Times saying, "Young couple wanted to work on an organic research station, full board, no pay."
You won't be surprised to learn that he wasn't exactly inundated with offers, but eventually one couple did take on the job, having at first negotiated the princely sum of £5 a week wages. Then, for the next 30 years, they educated, informed and inspired a growing army of organic gardeners.
Jackie and Alan Gear met as science students during the 1960s and were full of idealism to change the world. After graduating, Jackie worked as a sewage works manager and Alan as a civil engineer, but they weren't exactly realising their ideals until they started their new job with the HDRA in Essex.
It was a 90% salary cut for us, and it was a big loss in money, and we had to sell our house and our car, and we lived in a little caravan on this 1.5 acres of Essex, and everybody said we were mad. What were we doing getting involved with organic gardening when it was clearly a Luddite thing to be doing?
But Jackie and Alan took this on when the hippie era was in full swing. Amidst the love and peace and flower power, people were starting to realise that there were ways to live sustainably without damaging the environment.
We were very optimistic then that our generation, that we could change things. We really felt we could change things.
You know, the word environment had hardly been known before then, and suddenly people were looking at what mankind was doing to the planet. And there was also the first oil crisis, and questions were being asked, what are we going to do when the oil runs out? And it made us really think about what we were doing with our lives.
We are the Village Green Preservation Society. We were the real back to the land lot, so we kept chickens and we kept bees. And, you know, I used to bottle hundreds of pounds of fruit every year, dry my own herbs, grind flour to make our own bread. It was a lovely existence, and it was in the 70s, so everybody was love and peace.
Despite their hard work in Essex, Jackie and Alan felt that they were preaching to the converted. So, in 1985, they moved the HDRA to the heart of the country in Ryton, near Coventry.
I felt really strongly that if we didn't move on, we would just stay as what we were, which was a tiny little organisation dealing mainly with enthusiasts like ourselves, but we wanted to get the message out to the wider world. And I thought we couldn't do that from where we were in Braintree on this 2.5 acres, and we actually needed a visitor centre, a shop, a cafe, and most importantly, gardens open to the public where people could come and see with their own eyes that organic gardening worked.
And suddenly here we were on a bleak field in the middle of nowhere with about 12 months to get this thing up and running and open to the public. Otherwise we'd go bust because there's no money coming in. We'd spent it all on doing the thing. So it was a huge gamble really at the time.
For 30 years, Jackie and Alan have been the driving force behind the HDRA, which is now the largest organic organisation in Europe and has come a long way from its humble beginnings in Essex.
I really tried in the design of the buildings to not make the place look like a hippie enclave. I didn't want pine. I didn't want that sort of country hippie image, and you know, I certainly didn't want any weeds anywhere. I didn't want to give people the impression that being organic meant that you have to have weeds in the garden and that you could have a beautifully designed garden and yet still be organic.
As well as the garden at Ryton, the HDRA has expanded its research to help and inform commercial growers on how to grow crops organically. The work started by the HDRA has had far-reaching effect, and large organisations are now starting to draw upon it.
People like the National Trust and English Heritage actually worked with HDRA, restored the walled kitchen garden at Audley End, and the fact that, you know, they were prepared to work with us, I'm quite proud of that, because it shows organic gardening had really made it.
It's just amazing what they've achieved, and I'm constantly amazed at how Jackie seemed to be able to come up with, you know, new things and new campaigns, you know, to get people interested.
Somehow they've managed to persist. It's determination, keeping repeating the message, doing good science, good research. It's just been the most amazing, I think one of the great stories of horticulture in the last couple of decades.
Jackie and Alan have now semi-retired to Norfolk, where they work as organic consultants, as well as finding time for some hands-on gardening on their own allotment.
When you look round and see the way it's become mainstream now amongst gardeners, most gardeners they might, you know, confess to the odd bit of perhaps weed killer on the paths or something like that, but most gardeners will tell you that they want to garden organically in the best possible world.
We've got the job done as best we could, and I hope that we have, you know, helped the organic cause in some way and helped to promote organic gardening.
Our final hero is a man who's just mad about plants. And his thirst for knowledge about them has taken him and his Lancashire accent right round the globe. And everybody who meets him is struck by his irrepressible enthusiasm for plants and the stories that lie behind them.
Roy Lancaster is regarded as the most influential plantsman in Britain today. Through his worldwide expeditions, he's brought back plants that are now commonplace in our back gardens.
I was doing a talk at a garden centre with Roy, and each plant he would just go off around the world, you know, where he's seen it in the wild and the first time he ever saw it and how he used it in his garden. He stole the show completely.
His knowledge is encyclopedic, but it's not just that. He has this huge capacity for passing that knowledge on, for making everything sound easy and interesting, and you just have to grow it. You just have to do it.
He was almost the botanical son that my father didn't have.
He could make the most nondescript, green-looking plant the most interesting thing on the planet just by the very words and passion that he conveys.
What's more, he's from Bolton, so he's bound to be a good lad.
Let me show you that one first. I could see you looking at that, and that's a trillium. Lots of trilliums, mostly North American, one or two from Asia, and that's Trillium albidum. And what I like about this, I love those. This is typical. Everything's in threes, you see. There's the 3 leaves there, nice blotchy leaves forming a lovely collar. The 3 sepals there, and the 3 petals. And you can see the stamens inside. And you see the white petals and that nice dark stain at the bottom of the flower beneath the yellow stamens. I think that really stops your heart, that. It's a magnificent plant. This was a family garden, and so people, probably knowing me, wouldn't believe it. Roy, you'd actually give space for anything other than plants. Yes, I've had footballs coming in and breaking treasured plants, but I'm a father. It's a family home. We all share it, so you just got to shrug again, well, next year maybe.
Born Charles Roy Lancaster, this Bolton schoolboy had a fascination with the wild flora in and around his hometown, and this was fuelled by his first mentor.
Vicar Shaw. He came into my life when I was 15. I'd recently left school and I joined the Bolton Field Naturalist Society, and he came to talk to us about thistles of Britain. And can you imagine that? Thistles of Britain. How could anyone talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours, there were real lectures in those days, on thistles? But we were amazed, and I was so impressed. He taught me so much. He taught me about enthusiasm for a start. I mean, I don't think you can teach enthusiasm. It just comes, it just rubs off on you.
This enthusiasm was quickly picked up by BBC producers, and it wasn't long before he regularly appeared on television.
You get a whole patchwork effect. It's like a strange sky. Great brushes of spreading needles all the way around the shoots, and in bunches at the ends of the shoots, rather like a chimney sweep's brush. And look at the leaves, deeply lobed, sharply toothed, and becoming suffused with that rich red. They'll be producing bonfire tints. Those three-lobed leaves turn these superb colours. It always reminds me of a tramp with his clothes on fire. Certainly, whenever I get excited, I think, it's the vicar. I wish he was here. I wish he could see this with me, especially when I've travelled abroad.
Roy's travels have taken him round the world, from Nepal to Chile, in the garb of the plant hunter.
I would absolutely love to be on an expedition with Roy. I think he's the most amazing speaker and says it all with such modesty. I think that is quite important. I think I really like modest people. And I would think that's one of his very special qualities, modest when he really is so distinguished and such an important figure, because he has introduced so many very, very good garden plants.
This is Veronica, and I called it Georgia Blue, and it's a species called Veronica umbrosa. And I found it growing under the snow high in the mountains in the Western Caucasus, in the old Soviet republics. And I managed to tease a little shoot, just one slender stem out, which had roots on it, wrapped it in moss and brought it home. And now I see it in gardens and nurseries sell it here and abroad, and it warms the cockles of my heart when I think of when I first saw it.
Roy's first foray abroad was not for collecting plants, though. It was for 2 years' national service in Malaya.
And I remember pulling into Singapore Harbour, and everything I saw was new. There were palm trees, a lot of exotic foliage, and I remember thinking, right, I'm going to write about everything here, and I'm going to collect specimens of anything I don't know. And I did. And during my time in Malaya, those 18 months, I was pressing plants between sheets of paper under my mattress in the bed. Now, of course, you can imagine what my mates in the platoon thought about that. I was a Bren gunner, which meant I had to carry this damn thing with a strap around my neck, and it was heavy. I had extra pouches for the ammunition. I would empty 2 of the pouches and stuff the ammunition into my other pockets, leaving the pouches free to put specimens in. And as I went along, I could pick specimens or collect a beetle or catch a moth or whatever it might be and stick them in these pouches.
National service gave him a bigger thirst for plant knowledge, and Cambridge Botanic Garden was the place to quench it.
At that stage, you became like a human blotting paper. You just soak it up. Oh, come on, keep it going. And you soak it up. And it's there that I suppose I learned to soak up the information, but don't keep it. Don't make, it's no good just keeping it to yourself. Pass it on as fast as you can. Knowledge is to be shared. What else would you do with it, damn me? It's not something you put away in a box and forget about it.
Roy's passion for plants, along with his qualifications, eventually led him to work for Hilliers Arboretum in Hampshire, initially as a horticultural botanist and later as curator, and he was to stay at Hilliers for the next 18 years.
Roy would be working there on anything that my father threw at him in the way of find out more about this, Roy. He most probably called in those days Lancaster, because in those days one was not called by one's Christian name, by the boss. You were called by your surname.
Harold Hilliard, the head of the firm, the great man, he said, I would like to produce a bigger catalogue. I've got several thousand plants. They're not in the catalogues, so we can't sell them. So we really need to write something bigger. My job was to go around the collections, identifying plants that weren't named, and checking out plants which had names on them, and gradually compiling description for what was to become eventually the Hillier Manuals of Trees and Shrubs. Yeah. This one I used. That's the recent one. This is the one. And stuck together. I used to carry this around with me, and I went abroad and I cut out so I could quickly get to whatever I wanted. This came out of the time of when Chairman Mao's Little Red Book was being sort of bandied around. It was on all the television programmes, and millions of people buying it and flourishing it, but this was our little green book, and for all gardeners, this was the Bible. This is the one you must carry. There's about nearly 10,000 plants were described in this, between 8,000 and 10,000 plants. Of course, it's gone on from there, reprints and revisions to the present. Like that one, hasn't got a single photograph inside. You've got to be keen. The greatest enjoyment in life, and certainly in horticulture, gardening, and especially in plant exploration, it's the journey that counts. And people sometimes say to me, we've been all around the world looking at plants, all these Tibetan plateaus, here, there, everywhere. You must come back to Britain and think, ooh, you know, how boring to British plants, how tame it must be. And I said, well, it isn't. You walk in the woods, or you walk along the riverside, or on the Pennine Moors where you first started your interest in plants, and you see familiar plants from your childhood. And okay, you don't see thousands of unusual plants, which you can do in the Amazon and these other places. A comparatively few native plants in any given place. And yet they're all the more precious because of that. And you love them more because you have seen all this exotica. I suppose I spend most of my time thinking about, working with, writing, talking and telling people about plants. So that's my life, really. That's the essence of my life.
It's interesting that almost all these people have shared their passion for gardens and gardening with one other person that is important to them. And I know from gardening for over a quarter of a century with my wife just how significant that can be, how much it enlarges your own experience. And what's marvellous about our garden heroes is that they've made us feel important by sharing their passion through their writing, their broadcasts, or through direct personal contact. Our own gardens and our own lives are made so much the richer. If you want more information on our gardening heroes or anything else in tonight's programme, log on to the website bbc.co.uk/gardening.
A spectacular journey coast next on BBC Two. There's practical advice and inspiring ideas from the Gardeners World team in this Gardening from Berryfield.
Over the centuries, there have been many fashions and trends that have steered us to garden the way that we do. We've been inspired to grow new and exotic plants, we've landscaped our gardens, we've added pergolas and paving, and we've even sown wildflower meadows. But behind the scenes, there has been an horticultural elite who, unbeknown to us, have influenced the way that we garden.
Of course, it's impossible to say who is the best or the greatest gardener. But from anything else, there have been so many of them. But over the next hour, we shall be taking an intimate look at a small handful of our living gardening heroes.
we meet the man who has travelled the world in search of new plants and whose infectious enthusiasm never fails to inspire those who meet him. We meet the vegetable queen whose meticulous research changed our salad bowls forever and showed us that we could all grow veg even on the smallest of plots. We meet the man who masterminded some of the grandest restoration projects for the National Trust. And the gardener who was ahead of her time as an advocate of natural planting. We meet an extraordinary couple who gave up everything to spread the word of organic gardening. And the garden designer who transformed our traditional back gardens into stylish outdoor rooms. But first, we come to a man who's had a long and distinguished career in horticulture and yet still possesses the capacity to surprise and delight. I'm talking, of course, about Christopher Lloyd. Christopher Lloyd is one of our most successful and influential garden writers. His own garden, Great Dixter in Sussex, has become one of the most famous gardens in Britain. He has inspired us to be courageous and experimental and to break with convention when it comes to planting and the use of colour. At the age of 84, he is still pushing the boundaries. He's someone whose outspoken opinions are often contentious, but he is undoubtedly a brilliant plantsman and one of our great garden writers.
I think Great Dixter is one of the best gardens in Britain, if not the world. I love his writing too. You can